Hello and welcome back to another episode of Shoulders Down. I have tried to record this episode like two times already, and I have just like not felt like I was in the right space to do it. So, take three. I also feel like because it's kind of a controversial topic, I've been a little like hesitant in wanting to get it right, but I have a goal this year of being more not necessarily being more controversial, but taking a stand more and being more bold in my perspectives, because I feel like that's something I've held back on a little bit in the past and trying not to like ruffle any tail feathers, especially when I was on social media. It felt like just so many eyes. And I think it feels a little easier with the podcast and other content channels. So this is me sticking to my goal of being more bold with my perspectives. So, in today's episode, we're diving into something that I very recently realized, clarified, thanks to stepping back from social media. And that is this question of if intuitive eating is supposed to be about healing your relationship with food, what happens when food once again becomes the focal point of your life, just for a different reason? In this episode, I will first share how I came to ask this question. Then I'll share some about my personal evolution as a dietitian and former content creator on Instagram. We'll do some self-reflection. And then we'll talk about some concerns I have about intuitive eating content creators and explore what I mean when I say, are the intuitive eating dietitians okay? So, with that, let's dive in. To start with this episode, I want to trace how I came to ask this question. And again, the question that I'm asking is if intuitive eating is about healing your relationship with food, so your whole life doesn't have to be about food, what does it mean if you then make your whole life about food again, even if it's for a different purpose? To trace how I came to ask this question, we have to go back to March 2024, which is almost a year ago at this point. I had just left social media, and I will link below and link in the show notes my leaving social media episode, why I decided to leave Instagram. And suddenly I was feeling free of the task of constantly having to have this voice in my head saying I should take pictures of things or take B-roll footage of myself doing things and eating for content for Instagram. And I have deeply enjoyed this freedom from constantly having to record my life, including largely my eating and my eating decisions. And it got me thinking how interesting it is that for me, part of leaving social media was protecting the peace around food that I worked so hard to have after healing from disordered eating. I struggled with my relationship with food several years ago, like 10 years ago. And I have never lost sight of how grateful I am to experience peace with food on a day-to-day basis now. But what started to happen was that peace was being jeopardized by the demands I felt as a dietitian on Instagram that I had to be putting out content about food, and content that tended to do better and get better engagement was the kind of content where I was sharing what I called real life intuitive eating moments, walking my community through how I made eating decisions and using my eating experiences as teaching moments. So these are all things that I kind of was had floating somewhere in my brain and some sense about, even if I didn't have words for these things at this time. I think I wouldn't have said, oh, I'm leaving social media to protect my peace around food. I would have said I'm leaving social media to protect my mental health. I'm leaving social media because it doesn't feel like a sustainable business practice and all these other reasons. But I don't think I would have said that, oh, I work so hard to have peace with food and social media is stealing my sense of peace with food. That's not really something that I had clarity on until really recently. And it really came into clear view for me during my conversation with Amelia Ruby, which you can see the last episode on our feed, where I had this awesome conversation with her about our attention and social media and self-care and self-love. And it was just a beautiful conversation. And during that conversation, if you go back and listen to it, you can probably even identify the exact moment. There's a moment where I was finally able to put more concrete words to this feeling that I'd been having since leaving Instagram. And that really turned into this question. the question of if intuitive eating is about healing your relationship with food, so your whole life does not have to be about food, what does it mean if you then go and make your whole life about food, even if it's for a different purpose? That's how I came to ask this question. Now I'll take us a little bit deeper into my story and some self-reflection. So again, in leaving Instagram, I realized that part of what started to feel so funky to me about being on Instagram as an intuitive eating dietitian was that I work so hard to find freedom with food, and Instagram made me feel not free from food in another way. And it wasn't that Instagram led me to count calories or restrict food or even compare my eating decisions to others. Thankfully, I'm grounded enough in the intuitive eating work because it's been over 10 years for me that those types of thoughts aren't really the kinds of thoughts that I deal with. But what I mean when I say that Instagram made me feel not free from food in another way, I mean that being on that app as a dietitian and business owner made me feel like I had to turn my eating experiences into content. Sharing teaching moments using my eating experiences ultimately led to the same behavior of hyperfixation around food. It's just that before it was for the purpose of controlling what I was eating and manipulating my body size, but it turned into hyperfixation from a place of making content. And while I was in it, I didn't think it was a big deal. I shared content on Instagram for, let's see, like 3 or 4 years. But being out of it, I was able to see that it really did impact the quality of my eating experiences more than I gave credit to. Having to take pictures of my food or turn eating experiences into teaching moments did add stress to eating. And I can remember several times where it's like, okay, I sat down to eat, but then I was like, oh, this would be such a good real life intuitive eating moment. And I'd take out my phone and I'd start going. Next thing you know, I'd only have like 5 minutes to eat before I had to get on a client call. And obviously that's stressful. And I wouldn't have as much enjoyment around food. And maybe my food would be cold because I just went on talking and sacrificed the pleasure and the satisfaction of having the food more warm or freshly prepared or whatever, or having more time to eat it for the teaching moment or the content creation opportunity. So this brings me to the question, are the intuitive eating dietitians all right? Now, before we get into this question, I want to share something that I heard recently on the podcast, We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle. If you're not familiar, it's a really popular podcast. And recently, Evelyn Triboli, one of the co-authors of Intuitive Eating, was on that podcast talking about intuitive eating, which is a huge deal for the intuitive eating world because We Can Do Hard Things has such a big audience and such big reach. So I listened to the episode, of course. And in the episode, I was really struck by something that Glennon said. They were talking about how having like a lack of boundaries and always doing for others can impact our ability to hear our own body's cues and how that can impact our ability to eat intuitively. And Glennon said this thing, something along the lines of, I used to strive to be this like selfless person, and now I don't trust selfless people. And that really struck me. And the reason I bring it up here is because I used to look at content creation as an intuitive eating dietitian and think like, oh, great, cool way to share with people. And it's not that I don't trust intuitive eating dietitians who make content about their own food now. It's really not the case. It's more that I can't help but wonder if they are truly embodying what they are teaching. And again, it's not that like I even think that they might would be doing this on purpose, but because of my own experience and because of how I only realized how making content about my eating was taking away from the pleasure and the relaxation and joy of eating. I didn't realize that until I stepped away from Instagram. And I realized most people aren't going to do something as radical as fully leave a social platform that can be a large source of clients and revenue. And so because most people maybe won't do that, I wonder like if they ever could know that sharing food content is impacting their pleasure and enjoyment of eating, because it's very well could be the case that it's something that you wouldn't realize unless you stopped. And that's what it was for me is I was like, oh, maybe this is like a little bit taking away, but like it's part of my job and whatever. And again, I really didn't realize until I fully stepped away of like, wow, like eating feels joyful and peaceful and pleasurable on a whole nother level that like I had lost touch with because of the way that I felt like I had to extract my eating experiences for content. And by the way, that's like nobody said I had to do that. Like, could I have made content that wasn't about my own eating decisions? Absolutely. And I did. If you look back in the archives of my Instagram, it was a lot of more like text posts and that kind of stuff. But in a way, you become kind of like beholden to what gets engagement. And I notice that when I share more personal stuff, like what I'm eating, my eating decisions, my thought processes around food, that's what got the most engagement, like by a lot. So it's not that anyone was sitting there holding me to like, you have to share all your eating experiences. And it's probably the same for a lot of intuitive eating dietitians. But there is this very real reality of like you work hard on making content, you want it to be seen and you want it to resonate. And as a result, you can end up kind of getting pushed into corners of sharing things that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have, just from a place of responding to what the people are asking for or what it feels like they're asking for by what your engagement is showing. So that gets a little complex because it's like, yeah, no one is telling you you have to do this, but also it can start to feel like it's not a choice when your content creation is like tied to your marketing and your livelihood. So I just want to say, like, if you are an intuitive eating dietitian listening to this, like, I absolutely don't judge you and I get it. Like, yeah, having a business, you got to share content and you don't have to share content, you have to market somehow. Sometimes we can end up kind of responding to what it feels like people are asking for, and then that can lead us to a place where we've moved away from our own values or from our own intuition of what feels good. So again, it's not that I don't trust dietitians who share their food now or who share like, real life intuitive eating moments or whatever. But I can't help but feel slightly more apprehensive, wondering if they're walking the walk and truly protecting their piece around food, the same piece around food that they are working with clients to help them achieve. Again, the motivation is different. Working with clients as an intuitive eating dietitian, they're the clients are working on making peace with food and breaking up with diet culture. But as an intuitive eating dietitian, we can still end up feeling stress and anxiety and guilt around food, but not from the lens of diet culture or controlling our eating or controlling our body, but from the lens of having to use our eating experiences as teaching moments and as content. So different intention, same net impact. I mean, I'm not saying it's the exact same, of course, there's nuance here, but hyperfixation around food and sort of like watching yourself live your life instead of just living your life is another parallel I see here of like when we're in diet mentality, you're sort of like living outside of yourself and like watching what you're doing, what you're eating, what you're thinking about, what other people are thinking about you. And this same thing can happen when you're a intuitive eating dietitian content creator or any kind of content creator. But obviously, I'm talking specifically here about my experience as an intuitive eating dietitian. You can start being like, "Ooh, this would be a good moment." Okay, like, and then suddenly you're not in the moment. You're thinking about you're watching yourself live from outside of yourself. And that same disruption of presence and being deeply engaged, that's another impact of dieting and diet mentality. It takes you out of the present moment, it takes you away from being deeply engaged with your life. It results in you watching yourself live your life instead of being in the moment, enjoying living presently in your life. And again, same net effect, just different intention. So it makes me think. It makes me think. And another thing that we have to bring in here is the reality is that so many dietitians are attracted to the field because of their own struggles with food. I am not an exception to that. I went to school to study nutrition because I had disordered eating. And I was like, ooh, if I study nutrition, become a dietitian, I'll perfect eating and like then I'll finally have the secrets to, being skinny and whatever. And that's not what I ended up doing in the field, right? Like my intention for coming into the field, I ended up falling in love with intuitive eating and anti-diet and totally, going through my own process of breaking up with diet culture. But from interviewing so many dietitians on this podcast, I know that it is so common for dietitians to come to this work from their own struggles. And also that makes a lot of sense from bringing in a study, the Minnesota starvation study, which I will link in the description slash show notes below, an episode where I talk a lot more deeply about the Minnesota starvation study. But pretty much the Minnesota starvation study was during World War II, a group of conscientious objectors were used to observe the effects of starvation. And these were a group of totally healthy, physically, mentally healthy men. And they put them on a semi-starvation diet. And one of the effects was these men started becoming hyper fixated on food, fantasizing about food, collecting recipes, talking to each other about food. And they were people who like didn't previously have specific hobbies for cooking or, food in any way. But the point was the study captured how restriction, which, dieting, can lead to hyperfixation on food. And this really tracks when you look at people who have struggled with disordered eating and restriction and dieting being attracted to a career in food, being attracted to a career as a dietitian, because that obsession can drive everything that you think about. It can drive you to want to like base your whole life around food when maybe if you weren't struggling with the disordered eating, dieting, restriction, your brain would be drawn to other things. So we can't ignore that the reality that so many dietitians come to this work from their own struggles. And I can't help but wonder if some dietitians are posting messages that they actually currently need to hear because they've jumped too quickly from being the one struggling with the disordered eating to helping the people who are struggling. Now, this isn't to say like you have to be fully healed before you help other people. But I do think that providers owe it to themselves and their future clients or patients to make sure that they're stable in their own recovery and healing first before trying to churn out content and become a teaching figure. And I wonder sometimes, like, there's a certain dietitian I have in mind, and there's actually quite a lot of discourse about her on Reddit and stuff, like wondering is she okay? Because it seems like she does these like skits because she does these kind of like videos that are like skits and she's kind of acting out the people that are in diet culture and then like also acting out like the people who are out of diet culture, which is totally, fine and could be helpful and useful. But the discourse around her has been almost like it's almost like she's too good at it. Like it almost feels like, oh no, like are you so good at capturing the diet disordered mindset because you're currently in it? Like, and it just feels a little bit strange. And I can't speak on it. I don't know. I just have encountered some of this discourse through some dietitian colleagues, but it does raise an important question, which is like, again, are the intuitive eating dietitians all right? Now, to be clear, that's a little bit of a dramatic question. I think most intuitive eating dietitians are all right. I think it's often the case where intuitive eating changed their life. They healed from dieting. They want to give people this freedom and this incredible relationship with food and body that they've discovered or that they've like seen become possible for the people that they support. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I absolutely am not sitting here trying to say like, yep, all intuitive eating dietitians are struggling. And like, just because I'm off Instagram, I'm holier than thou. And like all the people who are still on Instagram still have disordered eating. I'm not at all trying to say that, to be extremely clear. I'm more so reflecting and asking this question of like, could this be going on a little bit? Like, I feel confident saying this must be a reality for certain percentage of dietitians where they've perhaps jumped too quickly from being the person struggling to trying to share content and trying to be in the teaching seat and the counseling seat when maybe they need to take a little bit more time with the healing themselves. And back to our bigger question of like, with how does social media play into this and like sharing all these pictures about your food, when I look back on some content that I encountered on social media, it almost feels like sometimes when I would see like intuitive eating dietitians being like, this is what I'm doing and this is why, like, it almost feels like they're trying to like justify to themselves to like soothe themselves and say like, oh no, like it's okay, like it's okay, what you're eating is okay, like you really are allowed to have that cookie, rather than like it being about teaching other people. And I don't know, maybe this is me being like so off the mark and like, yeah, maybe I'm like totally getting this wrong and it feels quite vulnerable because maybe I'm so getting it wrong, but it's just a feeling that I felt like I have to put words to because maybe other people have felt this way or are thinking similar thoughts. And I just wanted to follow the instinct in me that's telling me to be more bold with my point of views and perspectives and to share them boldly. Don't get me wrong. I think there's immense value in having a provider who understands what it's like because they've lived through it themselves. And I believe that that is incredibly valuable. I think that's part of what's made me an effective coach with my clients is I really do understand aspects of struggling with disordered eating and body image because it was the reality I lived in for several years. But again, I believe that providers owe it to themselves and their clients slash patients to make sure they're stable in their own healing first. And the amount of time that's right for a person and how many years between, you know, recovery or healing and coaching or counseling depends on the person. And I'm not here to say like what's right and wrong. I think only you, the person, know. And that's that's our responsibility, I think, as dietitians and providers is to sense that and really be radically honest with ourselves about that and not rush into the work. And I also think it's the responsibility of you, dear listener, the potential client or consumer of content or whatever it may be, to follow your own senses of like, does this feel like a person who I feel like I'm getting the right vibes from and getting the right vibes to, have this person be my coach or my dietitian. And it doesn't even necessarily just have to be about like, oh, are they in a stable enough place with their own healing? That's with so many things, just feeling like you guys are an aligned fit. I think that's so important. To bring this one step further, to ask the question, why does it matter? Like, okay, so what's the big deal if someone jumps into sharing content or coaching when they're not necessarily in a place of peace and freedom with food themselves? Well, to me, the big deal is that like so much of this intuitive eating work feels like it's about alignment and embodiment with our values. And it makes me wonder if a provider is, constantly sharing their food pictures and using their eating as teaching moments online, I'm inserting this projection from my own life of like, yeah, that actually was like kind of stressful and like made eating less pleasurable. And I couldn't see that until I was outside of it and on the other side of it. So if a provider is doing that and this is me again, lots of hypotheticals, but this is me assuming that like that is causing some amount of stress around eating for them, even if the stress isn't about calorie counting and being good and restriction, but the stress coming from this place of having to use eating experiences in content and teaching moments, then it makes me wonder, like, are they able to deeply embody the work that they're teaching, which is ultimately about radically protecting your peace around food? And I really believe that as a provider, we're only able to take our clients as far as we've taken ourselves. So that's where my concern comes in of like, I think if we want deep embodied healing, we have to embody the work ourselves as providers, coaches, dietitians first. And that doesn't just look like rejecting diet culture and making peace with food that way. I believe that peace with food is peace with food. It also means protecting our peace around food in other ways that we can, which might mean passing up the opportunity of turning a really potentially juicy teaching moment about food into content because you don't have enough time and you just want to enjoy your meal and not have to work while you're eating. So this these are my thoughts. These are my kind of messy thoughts about this and also my self-reflection. And one last piece I want to add to this is this question that comes up for me in this conversation, which is sharing food content more helpful or harmful? When I was on Instagram, I was sharing more snippets of what I was eating and real life intuitive eating moments and that kind of stuff. I never did the whole what I eat in a day because I found that to just be like absolutely a boundary where just too triggering, but I would share little snippets here and there. And I get it that it is helpful for people in my community and people in the, anti-diet community to see normal ways of eating, to normalize that, like, oh my gosh, especially coming from a dietitian. Like, I studied food for 6 years, and here I am saying, eat the Oreo, do, whatever, have plain pasta for dinner with no protein. You're going to be fine. It's really not that big of a deal. And I recognize how that permission can feel so freeing, and to see that permission embodied in a dietitian showing, like, yeah, this is how they eat. They're not, not every meal looks like a beautiful rainbow of vegetables, and like that's okay. But I also can't help but wonder, like, is it doing more harm or is it more helpful? Maybe it just depends on the person. But I remember having some conversations with clients back when I was active on Instagram, and some clients would be like, "Well, I saw you shared that you were like having cookies, but like in my head, I thought, oh, well, she probably just has like a few and then stops. Maybe I post something of, oh, I got full and there was just 2 bites left, so I just left the 2 bites on my plate. Like sometimes that's real life intuitive eating." And then I remember having clients say to me, "But like I can never leave a few bites behind," or like, what if I always finish my plate and never leave a few bites behind? Does that mean I'm not doing this right? So it still brought up some comparison. And I don't know. I just wonder, like, I don't really have the answer here. I just wonder, like, is sharing food content more helpful or harmful? I really don't know. And now my work is less visual in that, like, my main sources of content are the podcast, YouTube, which is visual, but I mean, not fully in the way that I'm using it. I guess I have posted some vlogs there that have more kind of real life intuitive eating moment type stuff since leaving Instagram. But also my blog, which is more writing and definitely less visual. Instagram, it really lends itself to that visual content, the videos, the pictures. And as a dietitian, that can so often lend itself to food videos and pictures. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on any of this, whether you're a consumer of intuitive eating content or a creator of intuitive eating content, a fellow dietitian or intuitive eating counselor. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on this episode. Again, like, the people pleaser in me wants to reiterate that I do not judge dietitians or intuitive eating providers or anyone who's sharing content on Instagram or any social media about their food. And maybe this is just like a whole lot of me projecting of, yeah, this was stressful for me and it added a level of stress to my own eating experiences. So it must be that way for everyone else. Maybe that's really not the case, but I have a hunch that it is for at least some amount of people. And maybe there's people who are like, yeah, it's a little stressful, but like it's not it's not enough for me to feel like the joy of eating is being diminished at all. And cool. There's no judgment here. The point of this episode for me is honestly like a lot of self-reflection, and also to ask this question of like, what does it mean to really embody this work? And to be radically honest about that, because I think it goes beyond rejecting diet culture. I think it extends into protecting our peace around food in other ways that our peace around food might be disrupted. That's today's episode. I would really love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on anything I've shared today. To wrap it up, we talked about how I came to ask this question. I shared some of my personal story, my personal evolution as a content creator on Instagram, now former content creator on Instagram, and how I saw that impact my relationship with food in sort of an unexpected way. And then I talked about some potential concerns that I have for intuitive eating content creators and asked this question, are the intuitive eating dietitians all right? So I hope that this episode was interesting for you. And thanks for bearing with me as I kind of stumble through a topic that I felt pretty nervous to deliver. I just want to be clear that I don't judge my colleagues. I just want to ask this question and like invite us all to protect our peace around food more deeply than just leaving diet culture and whatever that means to you. If you're not an intuitive eating dietitian, which a lot of people who listen to this aren't, you're more so the consumers of this content. Maybe that means boundaries with loved ones. Maybe that means putting your work down while you eat, or maybe it means something else. But I think it's an invitation we could all use. That is all for today's episode. Thanks for being here, and I will talk to you in our next episode.